Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I speak with Massimo Pigliucci. He's a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. His research is concerned with philosophy of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, and the nature of pseudoscience. He's received a doctorate in genetics from the University of Ferrara in Italy, a PhD in Botany from the University of Connecticut, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Tennessee. He's published over 100 technical papers and several books. In the areas of outreach and critical thinking, Professor Pigliucci has published in national magazines such as Skeptic, Skeptical Inquirer, Philosophy Now, and The Philosopher's Magazine, among others. He's also been elected as a consultant for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Pigliucci penned the wildly successful Rationally Speaking blog and podcast of the same name, and also maintains a podcast called How to Be a Stoic. Towards the end of the show, we started chatting about genetically modified and AI-augmented humanity, which will form the basis of another chat with Massimo in the future. But for now, please enjoy my conversation on Stoicism and how it can help you in your personal and professional life with the one and only Massimo Pigliucci. Welcome to the show, Massimo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and you're joining us all the way from sunny New York City.
Yeah, except it's not really sunny at the moment, but I mean, normally it is.
Yeah, normally, is that true, or is that a bit of a stretch there, normally sunny in New York City?
Yeah, I don't complain about the weather here. I mean, people complain about it, but it's pretty sunny. I'm a sunny kind of person, so I like this kind of weather. But today, that's not the case.
Fantastic. Well, let's make this a sunny kind of podcast episode then. And I mean, you came into my sort of radar recently when your book received some praise from Tim Ferriss, one of my favorite podcasters and New York Times bestsellers. And he publishes a weekly email called 5 Bullet Friday. And in that email, he said that your new book, How to Be a Stoic, was one of the best explorations of a Stoic philosophy that he's read. And having read that, I just had to get you on the show. So I got into Twitter, I found you, and here we are.
Yep, that's right. I'm glad that he liked it. I think it was a lot of fun to write. So that people like it.
Fantastic. And Massimo, just to give our audience some context, you were born in Liberia, you grew up in Rome, you're a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, and hold PhDs in genetics, evolutionary biology, and philosophy. And in the introduction to your new book, you say that you are by profession a scientist and philosopher and have therefore always been inclined to seek more coherent ways to understand the world through science and make better choices for living life through philosophy. And that seems to me like a very potent combination.
Yeah, it is an unusual perspective because, lots of scientists sort of, at some point in their career, they kind of play at being philosophers, but they don't actually do the work of going back to graduate school and get a PhD in philosophy. I did because I love philosophy. I always did since I studied it in high school. I grew up in Italy, as you said, and there it's mandatory to study 3 years of philosophy in high school.
Wow.
And my teacher was just wonderful, and she just made the topic come alive. So now that at the time, that did not dissuade me from going into a career into in the sciences, which I had already decided on. But I kept the philosophy always in the back of my mind. And at some point, when I had my midlife crisis or early midlife crisis, I figured, okay, what else can I do now that I've done like 20 plus years of biology? Oh, well, there is philosophy. So, and it worked out.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that that teaching philosophy or learning philosophy is mandatory in Italian schools. Is that something that you would suggest that more schools, say in the US or Australia, should look at? Or
yeah, I think that would be a good idea. Italy is not the only country. I mean, there's a number of other European countries that do that. I think some of the Scandinavian countries also has, if not 3 years, at least a course or two in philosophy. Yeah, I think it's a good idea because it seems strange to me that we study, we think that a well-formed education includes, of course, the sciences, that's for sure, but it also includes, literature and history. We want to know what other people, the great writers of the past have written, and we want to know, we want to try at least to pretend that we can learn from history, that sort of stuff. And then we leave out at the high school level or even middle high school level an entire chunk of, big thinkers over the last 2.5 millennia, the philosophers, and that seems like somewhat strange.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And, just thinking about it from my own perspective, it wasn't until I started studying philosophy in my late 20s that it had a profound impact on the way I approach life, and immediate impact in some cases, which I think a lot of people miss out on. And I guess as part of that has been picking up the likes of Epicurus, Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, some of the great Stoic philosophers, if you will. And first up, perhaps we should define what Stoic or Stoicism is all about.
Yeah, good question. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek-Roman philosophy that originated in Athens about 300 BCE. The goal of Stoicism is to figure out what the important things in life are. And the Stoics think that the most important thing in life is to essentially be a good person, be a moral person.
Yes.
And practicing what they call the four fundamental virtues, the four fundamental, cardinal virtues. And these are practical wisdom, which is the ability to navigate complex situations in the best possible way. Courage, not just physical, but moral, the courage to do the right thing, to stand up for people in the right way. Temperance, so self-control. And justice, which they conceived as treating other people fairly and the way in which you want to be treated. So for the Stoics, that's the top thing. That is a life that is worth living. It's a moral life. It's a life where you do the right thing. Now, that said, if you do that, they thought that you will achieve a state of sort of serenity in your life. You will, because you develop an attitude of equanimity toward what happens to you. If good things happen to you, you take them, you appreciate them, you develop an appreciation for good things in life. But if bad things happen to you, you say to yourself, well, it's not like the universe is after me personally. This stuff happens to a lot of people, and now my challenge is how do I best deal with it? And so once you get into that habit of mind, you navigate your life in a somewhat serene way, as much as it is possible for a human being, because you have developed this sort of attitude of equanimity.
Yeah.
So that's what it is. It's about giving meaning to your life in terms of sort of trying to do the right thing. It is about de-emphasizing the importance of external things. So it's not like the Stoics didn't like a good dinner or a nice vacation or a nice house and things like that. They were not into poverty or anything like that. But they also reminded themselves that fortune or the universe gives these things to you and just as easily as it takes them away, and that therefore you shouldn't be overly attached to them. You should enjoy them when you have them, but you shouldn't regret them if you lose them.
Yeah, and on fortune, I believe it was Seneca the Younger who said that which fortune gives you can easily take away, and it is not your own. That's right.
Epictetus said that everything you have is on loan from the universe.
Yeah.
And the universe, which is a nice idea, it's a nice concept. And he said also that the universe can take it back at any moment for any reason, and therefore you should be prepared that if that happens, you say, well, all right, I'll deal with this, and tomorrow is going to be another day.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess on that, I mean, I've often been asked the question whether or not Stoicism makes you a little bit, say, emotionally disconnected, where regardless of what happens, you'll be okay, or you won't really care
Yeah.
if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, what's your response to people like that?
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding of Stoicism.
Mm.
And Stoicism is actually, to be fair, not the only philosophy that is accused of that kind of thing. I mean, Buddhists get the same bad rap in that sense, because also Buddhism teaches non-attachment to material things and things like that,
Hmm.
and not only material things actually, but also people. That is, you should realize that even your loved ones. They're mortals. One day they may go. Your parents will die, and your friends at some point will die, and things like that.
Mm.
And so the idea is that you need to take that for what it is. That is, again, you enjoy them when they're with you. In fact, that's the idea that they're mortal. The idea that they're not going to be there forever means that you really should pay attention to what you have right now and enjoy it and be thankful for it. But so let me go back for a second to the issue of emotion.
Hmm.
Stoics are accused often of being unemotional or preaching sort of lack of emotion, sort of like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. But in fact, which, by the way, the character of Mr. Spock was actually apparently designed by Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, with the Stoics in mind.
Wow.
The problem is that Roddenberry did not have a good understanding of Stoicism, and unfortunately at the time Wikipedia didn't exist, and so he couldn't check the thing. Really, however, the idea of Stoicism is not to suppress emotion as much as to get away from negative, destructive emotions and sort of shift your emotional spectrum toward the positive. So, for instance, the Stoics thought that you should try to get away from things like hatred and fear and anger, especially anger. They had a big deal about anger.
Yeah.
And then move toward things like sort of rechannel your energy, your emotional energy, into things like love and concern for other people and sort of sense of justice, joy, enjoying the things in life, appreciating the things in life while you have them. So it's not really about suppressing emotion as much as it is about shifting the emotions, your emotional spectrum away from the negative and toward the positive.
And that aligns with what Marcus Aurelius said in Meditations, which is you have control over your minds and not external events. Realize this and you will find strength. And this is something that I meditate on daily. I think it's so powerful because people tend to, in our crazy internet-connected world, just get carried away with what other people think, get carried away with a negative review on a blog post or not getting enough likes on a Facebook post or whatever it is. But it seems you can always find things outside of yourself to find fault in, but how you respond to them is a different matter.
Correct. So that particular thought that you mentioned by Marcus, that actually is found in a lot of different cultures. So the most obvious example is the Serenity Prayer, which is an early 20th century Christian prayer, which is used often by 12-step organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? That prayer says something, I don't remember the exact wording, but it says something along the lines of, God, give me the ability to distinguish the things that I can do from those that I cannot do, and the wisdom to tell the difference, right?
Yes.
But that same thought is also found in Buddhist philosophy. It's found in medieval Judaism, and of course, it's found in Stoicism. You mentioned Marcus, but the most famous rendition of that in Stoicism is from Epictetus, who preceded Marcus by about half a century or so, or a few decades. And Epictetus, at the beginning of the Enchiridion, which is the manual, it's essentially a handbook on how to be a Stoic. At the beginning of the Enchiridion, he says, some things are up to us, other things are not up to us. And then he lists the things that fall into either category, and then he tells you, he makes what I call Epictetus' promise. It tells you that if you actually internalize that difference, if you deeply understand that difference, you will never blame anybody. You will never, be disappointed. You will always be in control of things. Why? Because the things that are really up to us, that is under our control, according to Epictetus, to the Stoics, are basically our judgments, our actions, our decisions, our values. Those are things that nobody can take from us. No matter what the external circumstances are, even under the most dire circumstances, you are still in charge of your judgments. You may be, in chains and as a slave, as by the way Epictetus was initially in the first part of his life, and therefore sort of it may be impossible for you to do much about your situation, but your judgment, how you actually think about your situation, how you think about what to do and what not to do is still up to you. And everything else, on the other hand, everything that is outside your career, who loves you or doesn't love you, the number of likes on Facebook, which of course Epictetus didn't worry about, all that kind of stuff. It's not up to you. Not meaning that you cannot influence it. Of course, you can have an influence. You can work on your career. You can work on your love relationships. You can even work on your Facebook likes. But ultimately, they're not under your control. Meaning that the outcome depends on other people's decisions, on accidents, on luck, on a bunch of other things. Now, that in Stoicism translates into, I think, a very, very powerful idea, which is that whenever you set yourself a goal, the goal should be an internal one and not an external one. You should shift your goals internally. Meaning this, for instance, let's say that I'm up possibly for a promotion in my job, right?
Yeah. Now,
most people would fret about it and would say, "Oh my God, am I going to get it? Am I not going to get it? Is my boss going to like me? Is there a competition? Whatever it is, right?" Now, Epictetus would say, "Hold on, calm down. Your boss liking you or not, it's not up to you. It's up to him. Whether there is competition, if you have colleagues who are competing with you or other people that might be better at the job, that's also not up to you. That's up to other people. What is up to you is, in fact, to do your best job in the best way possible, to put together the best resume you can, and to show to the world that you're actually worthy of that promotion. Then whether you get it or not, it's not your failure. Because if you've done everything that you could possibly do, then you're fine. You're good. At that point, whatever the universe decides, it's up to the universe. It's not up to you. Sometimes it will go your way. In fact, I would wager if you really did everything that is in your power to prepare for the situation, it's more likely than not that it will go your way. But sometimes things don't go our way, even if in fact all the cards look like they're lined up. Even if you really did do an excellent job, you did. Even if you probably did in fact deserve the thing. Other things can happen. I mean, your boss may get up in the morning and have a fight with his wife, and he's in a bad mood, and he's just not going to give you a promotion. That's it. End of story. What are you going to do at that point, right? You can blame, you can get upset, you can get angry, but that's not going to help. In fact, very likely that's going to make things worse, actually. Yelling at your boss because you didn't get a promotion, it's not likely to get you a promotion.
Exactly.
It's more likely to get you fired, if anything else. Right? So that's the idea that Stoics have. That is, if you actually shift the focus, the goal to an internal one, then you always win. No matter what actually happens outside, you always win because you're always in control of what you're doing. And then the outside stuff will take care of itself. And again, if you really are serious about concentrating on what you can do, more likely than not, things are going to work out okay.
Yeah, and you touched on a lot of different points there, Massimo. I mean, initially you were talking about being in control of our judgments, and I believe it's also Marcus Aurelius who says that if you remove the judgment, you remove the pain. For example, remove the judgment, I have been hurt, and you remove the pain of being hurt, and you will no longer have been hurt.
That's right.
And
I have an example of that, which I find very very amusing. So it turns out that a lot of Stoics are into this little game that is they are collectors of insults. So a typical Stoic exercise, which you actually find in both in Marcus Aurelius and especially in Epictetus, is that of training yourself to properly react to insults. And the idea, of course, so what Epictetus says is like, okay, an insult is somebody trying to hurt you, okay? Somebody saying something bad about you, trying to hurt you. Now, it is entirely up to you whether that's going to work or not, because somebody else can say whatever they want, but if you don't react in the way they expect, the insult falls flat, the attempt falls flat. He says you should react to insults in one of two ways. The easy way is just react like a rock. Imagine you're a rock. Have you ever tried to insult a rock? You don't get a lot of satisfaction out of it, because the rock is not responding. The other one, he says, if you're really well-trained, then you can answer with sense of humor, especially self-deprecating sense of humor. So let me give you an example. I have a colleague, Bill Irvine, who is also one of the authors of one of the best-selling books on Stoicism, modern Stoicism. Mm-hmm. And Bill is an academic, so he's in a philosophy department. And one day he meets a colleague in the hall of the department, and the colleague says, "Oh, Bill, I'm just wondering, I was pondering whether to cite a couple of your papers in a book that I'm writing." And of course, Bill's initial reaction is, he's glad.
Positive,
he goes, here comes a colleague that apparently thinks highly of him enough to, cite his work. Mm-hmm. But then his colleague goes on immediately and adds, "Yeah, but before I can decide, I have to make up my mind about whether your papers are simply misguided or downright evil."
Oh,
right. So now at that point, what do you do? And Bill remembered Epictetus, and his response was, "Well, why not both? They're not mutually exclusive. I could be both wrong and misguided and evil."
Yeah.
And of course, the colleague didn't know what the hell to say in response to that. Right? You completely disarmed the guy because, okay, now what am I? How do you come back from that sort of stuff? Mm. So the idea in general is that other people's opinions are not up to you, and they cannot hurt you. They can hurt you only if you actually let them.
Yeah.
It is in your power to react one way or the other. And I practice this every day because, as you probably know, I have a fairly active social networking life on both on Twitter and Facebook. Mm-hmm. And even though and on my two blogs. And even though many of my readers and followers are actually nice people who often write thoughtful things and so on and so forth, from time to time, and by from time to time, I mean at least once a day, I get some jerk who is out to troll me or to insult me or to just say something stupid. And so it's a very good training for me because I learned initially simply to ignore those things and just let them go, which is not easy because a lot of people feel compelled to respond to insults for some reason. And so it's even just the letting it go. It's not easy because it feels like you're making the other person, allowing that person to win. But then you have to ask yourself, win what exactly?
Exactly.
What sort of prizes did he win?
Yeah.
And then little by little you also develop a little bit of sense of humor because typically people are not very imaginative, so they pretty much come up with the same comments over and over. Mm. And so once you hear the same comment or a similar comment 3 or 4 or 5 times, by that time you thought of a very good sort of apparently self-deprecating, but in fact coming back kind of sense of humorous response, and then you just answer it that way, and they go away because they don't know what to say. They don't engage anymore.
Yeah, so I absolutely love that. I haven't come across that collection of insults. I'll have to look into that and maybe set up a game here with the team, and we can see how many insults we can collect over the course of a week or something. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you mentioned there that we feel like we need to respond if someone insults us, and oftentimes that's just our ego talking, and we don't want to feel like someone's one-upped us. And to your point about insults, I believe it's in Meditations where Marcus Aurelius says something like, "Today you'll meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, aggressive, treacherous, malicious, and all sorts of stuff, and you'll have a choice how you want to respond to that. And you can always bring yourself back to that centered, grounded place of reason and virtue rather than being responsive and emotional and just yelling at your boss who won't promote you or give you that job that you want."
Right. That quote from Marcus is one of my favorite because it actually encapsulates a number of things. Mm. The second part is the one about, it's up to you how to respond. And you don't have to let them get to you, right? But the first part is interesting because it says, essentially be prepared. When you go out in the morning, you will find people who are treacherous and liars and things like that, mm-hmm. right? And then he says, what, you expect humanity not to be like that? Well, then you're a fool. If you think that everybody's going to be nice and everybody's going to treat you well, then you're simply a fool. You just don't understand reality. And the Stoics were big about understanding reality. They thought that the best way to navigate the world is by actually understanding how it works. So you don't want to nurture false hopes. You don't want to be, positive no matter what. There's a lot of emphasis recently about sort of, yes, to stay positive in the face of, cancer or something. Well, no, sorry, I'm not going to stay positive in the case of in the face of cancer because I know that I have a pretty good chance of dying. There's nothing to be positive about. However, there is something to be realistic about. That is, if I have a problem or if I encounter a person that I know is going to be treacherous or a liar or whatever it is, then I know that in advance and I can prepare myself. So the very first part of that quote basically is a reminder to himself to expect certain things to happen. And if you expect certain things to happen, your mind is prepared. You're not going to be caught unaware. If you go out into the world and you expect if you get out of the house in the morning with a sort of a Pollyannish attitude about the world, you will get a lot of bad stuff happening to you, and you will not know how to respond. But if you have a more balanced understanding, I mean, Marcus wasn't a pessimist in that sense. He was just a realist. That quote, for instance, you mentioned, is counterbalanced, I think, by a great part of the first book of the Meditations, which is essentially an extended exercise in thankfulness. He starts out saying, I thank my mother for having taught me this, and I thank my father for having taught me this, and my brother, and my teacher, and so on. Yeah. So he was, he understood that some people out there are good people, and they really are trying to help you, and there is a lot that you can learn from them. And then other people are not like that, and you just have to go on into your life, into your morning with sort of an open eye, and try to make the distinction between what's what and who is who.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that. And I guess what's interesting to note about a lot of these philosophers from the days of Epictetus and Seneca and so on is many of them, maintain positions of very high authority in society. I mean, right up to Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor. And I guess today we have so many people when asked, do you engage in any form of philosophy, any readings, do you meditate, or have you got a fitness routine, anything that's going to make their lives fundamentally better in some way, oftentimes respond and say, well, I haven't got time for that, I'm too busy. Yet, you're the leader of the free world and you've got time for that, being Marcus Aurelius. And I mean, what's your view on that type of mindset, and would people like that benefit from, say, reading meditations or letters from a Stoic and so on?
Yes, I think that anybody can benefit from reading the Stoics, for one thing, because the Stoics are actually easy to read. Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius are very easy. You don't need any background in philosophy. You just read them. There are a lot of translations out there, and of course, if you go, my favorite ones tend to be the ones from the late 19th century, early 20th century, because they have a little bit of a more florid language. They sound a little more ancient, but in fact, there are very, very good translations in modern English, contemporary English, which is very easy to understand. And I don't buy this idea that people don't have time, because seriously, if you're running an empire like Marcus did, you don't have a lot of time. and even so, he brought Epictetus' manual with him, and he read the discourses, and he had the time to write down his own thoughts, which became then the meditation.
Yes.
But that brings me to a related issue. So recently, a number of people have told me, practicing Stoicism is a matter of, privilege. You can afford that because you're a university professor, you're highly educated. But, the working man, the working person, they don't have time. They have to put, food on the table, and they don't have the level of education that is necessary, and so on and so forth. And frankly, I find this very bizarre for two reasons. First of all, it's condescending. I mean, it's like, so you're telling me that the majority of humanity, anybody who doesn't have the privilege of being a university professor or something like that, can't read and they cannot improve themselves because they're too busy doing other things, or they're not educated enough. I'm sorry, I find that very condescending. I mean, I understand the good intention. I appreciate the good intention of so sticking up for the little guy, but you're also talking down to the little guy at that point. You're really sort of. I would find that insulting if I were not a Stoic, because Stoics, as I said, don't get insulted.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, people forget that although it's true, of course, that the Stoics that we know of, the Stoics that we have writings from, were all highly educated people. Obviously, Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. Seneca was a senator. Even Epictetus, although he started out his life as a slave, which was obviously by far the lowest rank on Roman society, even so, he was a smart guy, and he was then able to study philosophy under Musonius Rufus, who was one of the major Stoic teachers in Rome, and then eventually he was freed by his master, and he started his own school. So obviously, the people that we know of, whose writings we have, those were actually people that were fairly sophisticated and fairly educated. But let's not forget that Stoicism was one of the major philosophies among the common Roman people. It was very popular in the Roman army. For instance, lots of Roman soldiers were Stoics. And the Roman soldiers, I guarantee you, they were not particularly educated. They didn't have a lot of time to go to school. Literacy was very low in the Roman Empire. Even at its peak, it was not a very high thing. And these were, essentially poor people who would get into the army because otherwise their only alternative would be to sort of be engaging in sort of agriculture and making very little money. So this was actually a very popular philosophy. Everybody practiced, well, not everybody, but lots of people practice Stoicism. Yeah. So I find it that today we actually, sort of somewhat ironically, we actually have more time, even if you're not well off. I don't think it's going to take that much in the evening after you watch, instead of watching 3 hours of television, let's say, watch 2. And then spend a half an hour or 45 minutes, reading the meditations or do anything else that has to do with self-improvement. And the reason for it is because it's just going to make your life better. Yeah, it's going to give you, tools to actually improve your life. So yeah, I find that kind of comment very, very strange and somewhat sort of off-putting.
Yeah, and it doesn't require a lot. I mean, once you've spent literally a couple of hours just to read one of these older texts, what I do every morning before I leave the house, I'll just open, say, Meditations or Letters from a Stoic, or even something from Alain de Botton about the ancient philosophers, and open it up to a page, read maybe one page, take some words of wisdom out of that, and then meditate on that throughout my day. And it can have... for me, it's just a grounding thing where I've read this fundamental philosophy which just gives you a rule book on how to approach life, really, and not be overtaken by externalities and just be in control of how you respond to anything that goes on in your day. And it's just such a powerful thing. It doesn't require a lot of time.
No, exactly. And also because I like to say that Stoicism, like any practical philosophy, the very same thing is true also for Buddhism. And frankly, for things like Christianity, I mean, people think of Christianity, of course, as a religion, but every religion comes with a philosophy embedded in it. It's a philosophy of life. If you're a Christian, you're supposed to practice Christianity, not just read the Gospels. Yes. And but how do you practice, Christianity or Buddhism or Stoicism? Pretty much the way you were saying it. You read the texts, you meditate, you reflect on them from time to time. In fact, you read them over and over because you want to sort of internalize their messages. Then you talk to other people that share the same philosophy or religion, and then you go through your day in a sort of a mindful way. You try to apply those precepts. So Stoicism, like a lot of like any other religion or philosophy or practical philosophy, is maybe 1 part theory but 9 parts practice. It's not. It doesn't take a lot of time to actually read the stuff. But it does take a lot of effort sort of every day to practice it. But and so I'm told, again, another one of the criticism is, but Stoicism is a demanding philosophy because, you have to pay attention to the 4 virtues and you have to pay attention to everything you do, the moral dimension of everything you do. And I say, like what? Instead of what? Christianity, for instance? Yeah. If you're a good Christian, and by good Christian, I don't mean somebody who just says that he's a Christian and goes to church once a year. I mean, if you're really seriously practicing, what do? Aren't you supposed to pay attention every day, every minute to what you do and try to do the Christian thing in all aspects of life, small and big? That's what you're supposed to do, right? If you're not doing it, you're just a Christian in name, but not in practice. And so Stoicism is just as demanding as Buddhism is, or Christianity or Judaism. Any kind of philosophy of life or religion is demanding. That's the point.
Yeah.
Right? It's like somebody saying, so the Stoics very often made the parallel between your emotional and mental life on the one hand and your physical fitness on the other, right? So it's really like going to the gym. Or if you don't have time or money to go to the gym, then do some other kind of exercise, right? Go for a walk or go for a run or whatever it is, right? Well, you're supposed to do that, if not every day, several times a week. Because if you just do it once or twice a year, it's not going to do anything. It's everything that you want to do seriously, it's demanding.
Yeah.
Your job is demanding, right? You can't go do your job only once every 6 months. You have to do it every day.
Yeah.
And several hours a day. So I don't understand these. Oh, it's a demanding thing. Yeah, life is demanding.
Yeah.
What else? What else have you got to do?
Yeah, it's like when someone who say is a little bit overweight wants to lose weight, and they say, "Oh yeah, I tried the gym once, it didn't work for me."
Yeah, exactly. Well, that means you didn't try.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ongoing intentional effort day by day, and that's how you get the benefit. And you mentioned earlier that people often criticize Stoicism, or might say, "Oh, well, you're educated and you've got time to practice," and oftentimes that's just externalizing. It's not taking ownership, and I think taking ownership is something that comes with the territory of Stoicism. And for example,
Yes.
In my team, we had a particular client engagement that didn't quite go as planned, and it was one of our first top tier clients. We were absolutely more or less berated for a particular oversight, and I guess in this instance, it could have been really easy to point fingers, for me to blame my team members. It could have been really easy to wallow in despair, to go out, get drunk, do all that sort of stuff that human beings do to avoid taking responsibility.
Right.
And in this case, I guess, for me, it was, I sat the team down and I said, look, this too shall pass. Whether it's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, it will pass, and it will be confined to distant memories. If not, we'll completely forget about this in a year or so.
Right.
But it was about diligently tracing what went wrong, what could have been done better, how can we resolve this, communicating that to the client, having a clear strategy, and then taking responsibility, taking action. And still, if we were unable to resolve that, being okay with that, knowing that we did everything in our power to turn that around. And in this case, it just so happened that we did turn that around. We, client was happy. We won subsequent work with them. But it could have been very easy. There was that fork in the road where I could have gone in a completely different direction and would have had a completely different outcome.
Exactly. So the things you just mentioned are actually almost verbatim what Seneca suggests that we do every night. So he says, before going to bed, take a few minutes. This is a standard Stoic exercise. Take a few minutes. Go into a place of your house or your apartment which is quiet, and go over your day, and if possible, actually write it down. But at the very least, very carefully go over your day. The challenges of your day, not what you ate for dinner, but the challenging moments of the day, and ask yourself those three questions: 1, what did I do right? 2, what did I do wrong? And 3, what could I have done differently? And the idea, he says, is accept that you did something wrong and forgive yourself. Learn from the experience, right? Because you do want to learn from the experience, but then forgive yourself. It's done. It's at this point, it's no longer under your control. So it's useless to beat yourself up and say, "Oh gosh, I should have done this or that or the other." That's it, done. So you learn from it, and then you forgive yourself. The second one is, what did you do right? Because you want also to give yourself some credit, some positive reinforcement. I actually did a couple of things right today. And then the third one is, what could I have done differently? Because, life, that people say that life is so varied and so complicated. It really not. A lot of the stuff happens over and over. Very similar situations happen over and over. And so Seneca says, if you learn from your experiences and you think ahead of time, the next time that something like that happens, what is the best way for me to respond? What's a better way to respond? Then you definitely learn something. And so this is a standard exercise. I actually do it every night, and it takes 5 minutes.
Yeah,
It's not a big deal. But it becomes basically over time a kind of a diary of mindfulness, diary of self-reflection of the things that you've done and the things that you can learn from. So you become slightly, little bit by bit, a better person. Seneca famously said, I don't aim at being perfect. I just aim at being better than yesterday.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And while it's it's only 5 minutes, but it is the compounding effect over time that a lot of if you find yourself writing down what I did wrong, and every day it's the same thing, um, either something's fundamentally flawed or you will address that, and over time you will find yourself even in the moment where you're about to make that same mistake, addressing that and not making that mistake, and then that will come over time. It will be in what I did right today column.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. Now, of course, that became also what we call the meditations, right? So Marcus Aurelius' Meditations was actually not meant originally for publication, and in fact,
yes.
the original title was to himself,
Mm-hmm.
It was his personal diary, which he wrote, by the way, when he was on the warpath. Essentially,
Yes.
he was campaigning against the Marcomanni in the northern German frontier. And he was having a tough time. He did that for 8 years. Talk about a difficult life. I mean, Marcus had to deal with two major conflicts: one on the eastern frontier and one on the northern frontier.
Mm-hmm.
He had to do with an internal rebellion. One of his friends and confidants actually took up arms against him.
Yep.
And then he had to deal with a plague that killed 5 million people in the Roman Empire. So, this was not an easy time, and yet he is considered today one of the good emperors. The empire thrived under his guidance, and it was one basically reached the peak under himself and the couple of emperors that came before him. The Roman Empire was at its largest extent, and it was thriving and a rich country. So, yeah, there's a point to be made about being mindful, learning from your things, and then dealing with the whatever situation the universe throws at you, including plague and war and things like that. So the idea is that if somebody like Marcus could survive and actually deal better and thrive with in the face of things like plague and war, maybe we can deal with a colleague who is upset today, or your boss who's having a bad day, or your wife who is not in a good mood, or whatever it is, right? It's like our problems typically, most of the times, tend to be much, much smaller, and therefore we ought to be able to sort of deal with them without making a big deal or a tragedy out of them.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on that, Massimo. And I guess I wanted to sidestep over to a quote from Seneca the Younger. It is along the lines of, "It's not the man who has little that is poor, but the man who craves more and covets his neighbor's property that is poor." People that always want more, always need more forms of external validation. And I think in today's society, we have people who are striving to be their best, whether it's an entrepreneur, whether it's an athlete, whether it's a musician. And, countless stories are told of people who work really hard to reach the holy grail, so to speak, and have bags of money and everything else, only to realize that the joy it brings is absolutely temporary, and they go on being unfulfilled. And most recently, Chris Cornell, singer of Soundgarden and Audioslave, took his own life, despite having all the trappings of success, fame, money, everything. And I mean, how does Stoicism help us navigate I suppose that paradox, if you will?
Well, so Seneca is actually a very good one to turn to for that, because he was, in fact, the second wealthiest man in Rome at some point. I mean, he was just right behind the emperor, right? Unfortunately for him, that emperor happened to be Nero, one of the craziest emperors in Roman history, right? And Seneca happened to be his personal advisor. He certainly did not have a good time with that. But so Seneca was a wealthy man from a good family in Rome, and then he lost everything. He was sent into exile by the Emperor Claudius. At that time, he was in his early 40s. So he lost everything, and he was sent to the island of Corsica in the Western Mediterranean for several years. Then eventually he was recalled, and he came back to Rome, and he eventually was appointed as tutor of the young Nero before he became emperor. Then he built back up his wealth to really unimaginable levels. I mean, he was the Bill Gates of the time. Okay, and then of course he lost almost everything again, and in the end he lost his life, because even though he tried to control Nero in the first 5 years of Nero's reign were actually pretty good, and that was in part due to the effect that Seneca, so the calming effect that Seneca had. But Seneca also had to make a lot of compromises. He had to basically cover up for some of Nero's crimes, because he had to decide, okay, what am I supposed to do here? This is a really awful situation. There's no good solution. There's just a bad and then really bad. And so he went for bad instead of really bad. So he had a really hard time. But throughout all of it, he kept reminding himself and his friend, he wrote these letters to his friend Lucilius, and he kept reminding Lucilius, like, look, it's fine if you have good things, if you have good meals, good house, and all that sort of beaches and all that. But be careful, because not only fortune can take him away, but they're also he observed lots of people once that they start having stuff, they want more. And it's a never-ending thing. You have 2 houses, you want 3. You have 3, you want 5. You have 3 cars, you want 5, and so on and so forth. And today, of course, psychologists refer to that as the hedonic treadmill. This idea that once you have something, you get used to it, and you don't get the same pleasure from it, and therefore you just want something more, right? And it's never-ending. Now, the Stoic response to that, in fact, Seneca says that one of the things you should do is not only to sort of be mindful about it, or remind yourself that, in fact, all of this is temporary. It's not really ultimately important. What is really important is how do you deal with other people and how you behave in life, not what you have. Because you can be really rich and a jerk, or you can be really poor and a really nice person that everybody wants to hang around. Right? So the two have pretty much nothing to do with each other. But not only that, he said that one of the things that you could do is to, on purpose, from time to time, as a reminder to yourself, deprive yourself of certain things. So Seneca was known, for instance, from occasionally for going out in the day in a cold Roman winter, underdressed, right, with not enough clothing, or he was known to fast for several days. Or to have a meal, was very, very, very simple meal. And he writes to his friend Lucilius, he says, once you do that from time to time, and then you go back and have a regular meal, or you go back and wear your regular clothes, it's unbelievable how good it feels. It's like, and so that's a way to. Modern psychology actually backs up this kind of exercise. If you want to slow down or stop the hedonic treadmill, engage in some, from time to time, in some exercises of self-deprivation. Nothing extreme. You don't want to starve yourself to death or something like that, or go poor, for really poor, for some time. Just small things. Typical exercises are, fasting for a day or two, or as I said, going or sleeping on the floor or in an uncomfortable situation one night every once in a while. Or as Seneca was saying, going out in the morning. One of my favorite is actually to take a cold shower. Which incidentally also has health effects, because it appears modern science tells you that cold showers, at least from time to time, help you boost your immune system. But that's that's a plus. But if you do it once in a while, it's unbelievable how good it feels the next time you take a hot shower. And so it's in a sense, it's an exercise also in thankfulness, right? So restraining yourself from time to time means that then you become more aware of the good stuff that you do have and you don't appreciate. We take for granted hot water, even though lots of people in the world don't have hot water. We take for granted, a good meal, at the end of the day. Well, in fact, lots of people in the world don't have a good meal, or they have they really struggle to eat and to nourish themselves. So we take lots of this stuff, good clothing and all that sort of stuff, for granted. And from time to time, this is really, really good exercise in thankfulness and being mindful of what you have and appreciate what you have.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few things there, like the cold showers is something that I definitely vouch for. It's about 14 degrees in Melbourne at the moment, 14 degrees Celsius, that is. So early in the morning after a workout, I jump in, just straight in, don't wait for it to, don't have the cold shower afterwards, but just straight in, going cold. And that first couple of minutes, freezing cold, and then I'll slowly turn up the warm water, and it is the best feeling in the absolute world. But you're absolutely right, because it does help to also repair, like you said, mitochondria, which is essentially the battery source of our cells. And there's so many other benefits that come with cold showers, just decreasing anxiety and so many other things, and generally just feeling more positive. But anyway, I won't go too much into the science of cold showers, or the pseudoscience in my case rather, of cold showers. But look, there's a few other things I wanted to touch on, and I guess Stoicism today, particularly in Silicon Valley, it's being I suppose there's a bit of a resurgence, if you will, spearheaded by the likes of, Tim Ferriss, who I mentioned earlier, Ryan Holiday as well, who wrote The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy, which are two books that draw very, very heavily from Stoicism. What's your take on this sort of resurgence?
Yeah, so that's interesting. As you know, it's not just Silicon Valley. I mean, it is resurging all over the Western world, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. I think there's good reasons for that. So, in a sense, I think of Stoicism as the Western equivalent of Buddhism. The two philosophies are very similar. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities between the two. There are also some major differences, especially in the metaphysics. The metaphysics underlying the two philosophies is very different. For instance, the Buddhists think that the self is an illusion, while on the other hand, the Stoics think that no, the self is you. It's your fundamental aspect of as a human being. But outside of those things, there are actually a lot of similarities. There is a lot of emphasis in the dichotomy of control, the realizing what is up to you and what is not up to you, a de-emphasizing of external things, a non-attachment to things, and sort of a control, redirection of the emotions from the negative to the positive. All that stuff is very common between the two. The difference, however, is that if you grow up in the West, in a Western society, you will respond much more easily to Stoicism than to Buddhism, and there's good reasons for it. First of all, the language. The language of the Stoics is definitely a Western language. They talk the language of sort of reason and logic and so on and so forth. While on the other hand, the language of the Buddhist texts tends to be, a typical Eastern language. So it's much more, from our perspective, it sounds a lot more mystical. It sounds a lot more, metaphorical, a lot more difficult to actually understand. Now, if you grow up in that culture, it isn't. It's perfectly fine. But if you grow up in the Western culture, it's a little more difficult to relate to. But so that's one thing that is happening. I think that a lot of people are seeing this as a good alternative, a more approachable alternative. The other reason, by the way, why a lot of Westerners respond more easily to Stoicism is because a lot of Stoic ideas were actually incorporated in Christianity, and so they sound familiar. Like as I mentioned earlier, the Serenity Prayer and things like that. Think about it this way: not only all the early Christians knew and wrote about Stoicism. I mean, Paul, as in St. Paul, knew, for instance, Seneca's brother. He wrote about Stoicism. St. Augustine wrote about Stoicism. Thomas Aquinas wrote about Stoicism. So there's a lot of Christian literature. But it's not that they just wrote about it. They actually absorbed a lot of the ideas. Epictetus' manual, for instance, was used as a training manual by Christian monks throughout the Middle Ages. So one of the reasons that Stoic ideas feel very familiar, very sort of almost eerily familiar, is because in fact we have already absorbed a lot of them through the teachings of Christianity, which is obviously much more prevalent in the West than in the East. So that's one of the reasons. Those are the major reasons why I think that Stoicism is a good alternative to Buddhism. But the reason it's so popular now, I think, depends on a number of other factors, one of which, probably the most one in my mind at least, is that both Stoicism and Buddhism are philosophies that originated during periods of turmoil. Stoicism originated in Hellenistic Greece right after the death of Alexander the Great, when the empire that he built fell into pieces, and there were all these major big upheavals that were happening in the world, and people had no idea how to deal with them. They felt like they had no control over what was happening. And I think we live, the latter part of the 20th century in the early part of the 21st century is a world, in a sense, very much like it. We are faced with challenges, obviously beginning with terrorism, but also environmental disasters, financial collapses and things like that. Those are things that the single individual feels completely powerless about. It's like, what am I supposed to do about that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
And that is profoundly upsetting. Those are things that can really affect people, can really make them feel uncomfortable at a sort of an existential level, maybe even at a subconscious level, but it's deeply unsettling. And things like philosophies like Stoicism and Buddhism, who teach you to remind you of where the locus of your control is. They remind you of what is it that you can do and what is it you cannot do, what you should care about and make a priority, and what you really should try to avoid because it's not really under your control. Those tend to become popular, again, in periods like that. So it has been this way throughout the centuries and the millennia. These philosophies go sort of up and down. If things are going well, people become more hedonistic, more sort of appreciating the good things in life. But when the good things in life feel like they can change on a dime, you don't seem to have control over the big things that are happening, then that's the time where you say, oh, wait a minute.
Yes.
I need to do something else about it. I need to reprioritize things in my life.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess I wanted to wrap up the questions around looking at the intersection of science and philosophy, which is pretty much your sweet spot. And
Right.
Science helps us understand the world, and philosophy can help us make better decisions as human beings. And recently read Homo Deus from Yuval Noah Harari, and in his book he argues that humans may be nothing more than algorithms, and that life, emotions, feelings is nothing more than data processing. What's a Stoic's view on this?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so either as a Stoic or as a scientist, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
It also depends on what one means by that phrase, because
Yeah.
I don't think there is anything mystical about being a human being. I mean, human beings are biological machines, if you will, if you want to use that terminology. Right? Our brains are made of stuff; they're made of matter.
Yes.
And in that, the Stoics, one of the reasons I found the Stoics very interesting is because their metaphysics was in fact very highly compatible with modern science. They were materialists. They thought that everything is made of matter. Even when they talked about the soul is made of matter. The soul is what we today think of as whatever part of the brain makes possible for the mind to work, for us to think and make decisions and things like that. That's the soul, and it's made of stuff.
Yes.
God. They talked about God, but they thought that God is the same thing as nature and the cosmos at large, and so God is also made of stuff. It's material, and in fact, we are in an important sense bits and pieces of God's stuff because we're bits and pieces of the universe. So if the idea is that we should get away from sort of a transcendental, mystical understanding of humanity, very much like the one that Christianity puts forth, right? For Christians, the body is just a shell, and then the soul is the real thing, and that's going to survive death, and that's going to have, that's where the real stuff happens. If what we're saying is that that's not the case, that we're material things, we are finite, and we react in sort of predictable ways because of our biology makes us in a certain way. Yes, I completely agree. That's definitely the case. But when you start talking about human beings being just algorithms, well, an algorithm is a computable thing. It's a computable procedure that it's put together in order to solve a problem. And we are not really like that. I mean, people use often the metaphor of genes as blueprints for the organism, for instance. And that's a very unfortunate metaphor because genes are nothing like blueprints. They don't carry the instructions, literally the instructions for making a human being or any other living organism. They are specific types of biomolecules. They do carry information, that's for sure, but they don't do anything by themselves, for one thing. If they are not actually surrounded by a certain cellular environment, enzymes, proteins, and things like that, they don't do anything. DNA just stays there. It doesn't do anything by itself. But even when they do, all they code for directly is proteins. The only thing you get out of genes is proteins, enzymes, things like that. You don't get complex behaviors. You don't get complex developmental processes. You don't get anything. All of that other stuff comes out of a continuous, very complex, very nonlinear interaction between the genes, the developmental system of organism, and their environment. And if you want to call that an algorithm, go ahead. But I think it's misleading because it simplifies things too much. Thinking in terms of an algorithm makes you immediately think about the difference between software and hardware. And you say, okay, so I can write the software and then I can put the software in whatever hardware I want, and it doesn't matter. It's cross-platform. Living organisms don't work like that. If you put a piece of DNA in a different environment, it will do different things, and it probably will do catastrophic things. For one thing. I don't like that metaphor because it's misleading. It's a little too mechanistic in the bad sense of the word. Again, I'm not trying to push any sort of mystical or vitalistic notion of humanity. Human beings are just social primates, particularly smart social primates, but that's all we are. We are the process of the result of a process of evolution. So in that sense, I'm a materialist, just like the Stoics were. But I get a little worried when people use metaphors in a way that is potentially misleading. We are living organisms. We can certainly change ourselves. I mean, we are now getting to the point where technologically is for the first time in human history, and in fact for the first time in the history of the biosphere, it's going to be possible to actually genetically modify our own lineage.
Yes.
Right? We're not quite there yet. It's not quite.
It's getting there.
But we're gonna. Yeah, it's gonna get there. It's we've done it with other organisms. We've done it with laboratory animals. So there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be able to do it on ourselves if we want to do it. Now that's a different issue. Is that a good idea? Who's going to make that kind of decision? Who's going to pay for the cost? Who's going to own the technology? Those are, that will take a whole different episode just to talk about that stuff, right? But we're certainly about to cross that threshold. And I would say that serious philosophies of science, philosophies of life, like Stoicism, but not just Stoicism. I mean, I just happen to be a Stoic because Stoicism resonates with me both culturally and in terms of personality. But if you're not a Stoic, you're a Buddhist. If you're not a Buddhist, you're something else. If you practice a serious philosophy of science, I keep saying philosophy of science because that's my field, but no, it's a philosophy of life. If you practice a serious philosophy of life, if you really want to improve, your life, and you want to think also from a moral standpoint, then you really ought to apply those philosophies to the big questions that are facing humanity. And one of those big questions is, okay, once we have the technology to genetically engineer the next generation of human beings, how are we going to use it? What are we going to do about it? How are we going to distribute it? Who's going to have access to those things? Those are serious questions. And those are not really technological questions, those are moral questions. And so having a well-developed, well-thought-out philosophy of life is going to help you in that area.
Yeah, and I guess that may then extend to augmenting human beings, not just genetically, but with, say, artificial intelligence. And
that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's right. Any major change we're going to make to humanity in the near future will have huge repercussions from a moral perspective, from an ethical perspective.
Of course.
And that doesn't mean, I'm certainly not against technology. I'm talking to you via a wonderful iPad Pro. I have my iPhone next to me, that sort of stuff. So I'm certainly not against technology. Technology is a wonderful thing. But technology in and of itself is neutral from a moral perspective. You can do good things, you can do bad things. You learn how to break the atom, and you can make very cheap and energy for all of humanity, or you can make a lot of bombs and destroy the planet. It's up to you, meaning it's up to us. Right? Exactly. And so the same goes, I think, for biotechnology, bioengineering, or human enhancement through hybrid technologies. The technologies themselves are neither good nor bad. We bring good and bad in the world, and that actually, I think that it's a good thing to have at the end of the show, because that's a thought that you find explicitly in Seneca. Just the other day, I was reading a letter that he wrote to Lucilius, and he said, good and evil are not in the world. Good and evil are what we do about what's in the world.
That's a beautiful way to finish the show, Massimo. Thank you so much for your time. Before we wrap up, though, your new book, How to Be a Stoic, is out now. It's on Amazon and all places where good books are sold. People can find you online. You're on Twitter at Pigliucci. That's Pigliucci. You've got the How to Be a Stoic blog at howtobeastoic.wordpress.com. Obviously, you can just search for the book on Amazon. And you also hosted a podcast, which you're not doing anymore, called Rationally Speaking. But people can find out about that at rationallyspeaking.blogspot.com. Anywhere else they should go to find out a bit more about you and connect?
I have a second blog of sort of general philosophy and science, and that's called Footnotes to Plato. The address is platofootnote.org.
Fantastic. Well, we'll include that in the show notes for the listeners. Thank you again, Massimo. Any parting words of wisdom?
No, I think it's just a good night or a good morning for you guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Massimo.
All right. Bye-bye.
Great. Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.